Welcome to Relaxing Subjects. Tonight, we are going to slow down together and spend some time with one of the oldest and gentlest rivers of human thought, the core teachings of the Buddha. There is nothing here you need to study, nothing to memorize, nowhere else you need to be. You do not need to know anything about Buddhism to listen tonight. You do not need to believe anything, or agree with anything, or carry any of it into the morning. You only need to lie back and let the words move over you the way a slow tide moves over smooth stones in the dark. If you feel like it, before we begin, you might leave a small note in the comments. What time it is where you are and the place you are listening from. It is a quiet thing to know that all across the world, in all those different hours, other people are settling into the same stillness you are settling into now. Some of them are in the deep middle of the night. Some are in the grey hush just before dawn. Some are lying down in the long blue evening. All of them, like you, are letting the day set down its weight. So take a slow, deep breath. Let it fill you gently, without effort. And then let it go, all the way out, the way you would set down something you have been carrying for too long. Wherever you are, in a bed, on a couch, in a quiet room, with the lights low, let yourself settle in. Let your shoulders come down from wherever they have crept up to. Let your jaw soften. Let your hands grow heavy. There is no hurry now. There is only this slow unfolding and your slow breathing and the long, kind dark all around you. Thank you for joining us here at Relaxing Subjects. Let us begin. I want to start not with a date or a place, but with something you already know, something that lives close to the bone in almost everyone. It is this. Most of us spend our whole lives defending a self. We carry it the way you might carry something fragile through a crowded room, held close, guarded, watched over. We defend its opinions and its history. We defend the story of who we have been and who we are trying to become. And at night, when the lights go out and there is nothing left to do, that defended self often does not rest. It keeps going. It replays the day. It rehearses tomorrow. It argues with people who are not in the room. It is restless, this self we guard so carefully, and it rarely tells us why. If that is happening for you right now, is say if some part of your mind is still turning, still bracing, still holding on, I want you to know that this is not a flaw in you. It is not a personal failing. It is one of the oldest human experiences there is. 2,500 years ago, a man set out to understand exactly this restlessness, this quiet dis-ease that runs underneath even our calmest moments. He did not set out to start a religion. He set out, you might say, to understand why the mind cannot seem to put itself down. And what he found is what we are going to spend these slow hours with tonight. You do not have to do anything with it. You only have to let it be told to you gently, the way a story is told to someone falling asleep. Let me give you first just two small images to hold, not to study, just to rest your attention on the way you might rest your eyes on a candle flame. The first is this. A man, after years of seeking, after pushing his body to the very edge of starvation, sits exhausted near a river. He's so thin that the old texts say, when he touched his belly, he could feel the bones of his spine through it. He has tried everything. He has denied himself food, comfort, sleep, ease, all of it, in the belief that punishing the body would set the mind free. And it has not worked. He is no closer to the peace he is looking for than he was in the palace he left behind. And then a village woman named Sujata comes to the river and offers him a simple bowl of milk rice. And he takes it, he eats, he lets himself be nourished again. And in that one small ordinary act, a starving man accepting a bowl of milk rice, something turns. He understands in his own body that the answer is not in indulgence and not in self-torture, but somewhere in the middle on a quieter road between the two. That road would come to be called the middle way. Hold that image gently. A bowl of warm milk rice offered by a stranger, accepted by a tired man at the edge of a river. We will return to it. The second image is even simpler and even softer. There is a word at the very heart of this teaching, a word for the peace it points toward. The word is nirvana, or, in the older language, nibbana. And though whole libraries have been written about what it means, the word itself is wonderfully plain. It means simply to blow out a flame. Picture a single candle burning in a dark room. Picture the small heat of it, the way it flickers and reaches and never quite holds still. And then picture a slow breath and the flame going out, not violently, not with any drama, just out. And in its place, a soft, cool dark and stillness and rest. That is the picture the word carries, not a place you go to, not a reward you earn, just the quiet that comes when something that was burning is finally allowed to stop. Hold that one too. A candle and a breath, and the gentle dark afterward. We will come slowly to what all of it means, but first, let us meet the man himself, not the legend, but as much of the person as history will let us see. His name was Siddhartha Gautama. He belonged to a people called the Shakya clan, and one of the names by which he is known, Shakyamuni, simply means the sage of the Shakyas. It is not really a personal name at all, but more like a title of place and people, the wise one who came from among the Shakya. When exactly he lived is something that honest scholars still gently disagree about. The traditional account places him in the 6th and early 5th centuries before the Common Era. Other careful readings place him a little later. What most modern scholarship agrees on is something broad and unhurried, that he lived somewhere in roughly the 5th century before the Common Era, in the foothills and plains where India and Nepal now meet. We do not need a precise date tonight. It is enough to know that he lived a very long time ago, in a world without writing for such things, a world of oral memory, of teachings carried from mouth to ear across the generations like a song. He was born, by the oldest accounts, in a place called Lumbini, which today lies in present-day Nepal, just north of the Indian border. And here is one of the few truly solid pieces of physical evidence we have for any of this. A pillar, a tall column of polished stone that the great Emperor Ashoka had raised at Lumbini around the year 249 before the Common Era. We will meet Ashoka properly much later in our journey because his part in this story is larger than most people realize. But for now, simply know that this pillar still bears an inscription naming that very spot as the birthplace of the Buddha. It is a small, quiet anchor in a sea of legend, a piece of carved stone standing in a field saying, "Here, this place, this is where he was born." There is something steadying about that. Among all the beautiful stories we are about to move through, here is one plain thing made of stone. His father was named Suddhodana. He is often called a king, and in the old stories he is every inch a king with palaces and guards and gardens. The truth is likely a little smaller, and in its way a little more interesting. Suddhodana was more accurately a leader of his people, a Rajan, an elected chieftain of what was less a kingdom in the grand sense, and more a kind of small republic, an oligarchic clan state, where the leading families held council together. So picture not a vast golden empire, but a comfortable, well-defended community of some prominence, ruled by a respected man among respected men. Still a life of privilege, certainly. Still a sheltered, soft, fortunate beginning, but a human one. His mother was named Maya, also called Maya Devi. And here the story turns tender and a little sorrowful, the way real life so often does. By tradition, Maya died only 7 days after giving birth to him. So the child, who would one day spend his entire life contemplating impermanence and loss, began his own life, in the very first week of it, already touched by loss. He was raised instead by his mother's sister, his aunt, a woman named Mahapajapati Gautama, who took him in and brought him up as her own. We will not dwell on the ache of that. But it is worth holding for a moment the quiet fact of it, that the great teacher of letting go was himself, from his first days, a child who had already had to let go of the one who carried him. Perhaps it shaped him, perhaps it did not, we cannot know, but it is a soft thread running underneath everything, and I wanted you to have it. As for the name itself, Siddhartha, it carries a meaning the way many old names do. It means, roughly, one who has accomplished his aim, or one whose purpose is fulfilled. A hopeful name to give a child, a name that gestures towards some great fulfillment to come. Whether his parents knew how strangely true that name would turn out to be, no one can say. But it is a lovely thing to be given a name that means your purpose will be reached, and then to spend a whole lifetime, against every expectation, reaching it in a way no one could have planned. Now from here, the story passes from the firmer ground of history into the softer ground of tradition. The stories that were lovingly told and retold and written down generations after the fact, the way a beloved life is always wrapped over time in meaning and in legend. I will tell you these stories as they have been told, but I want you to hold them lightly, the way the old tellers themselves understood them, not as a courtroom record, but as the deep, true poetry of a people remembering their teacher. Tradition holds then that around the time of his birth there came a prophecy. A wise man or several looking upon the infant foretold that this child would become one of two great things. He would become either a great king, a ruler whose dominion would spread far and wide, or he would become a great holy man, a spiritual teacher who would turn away from the world entirely to seek the truth. And his father, the story goes, knew exactly which of those two he wanted. Suddhodana wanted a king. He wanted a successor, a ruler, a son to carry the family's standing forward into the world. The idea of his boy wandering off into the forest as a penniless seeker filled him with a kind of dread. And so he made a decision, a loving decision, a fearful decision, the kind of decision a parent makes when they are trying to protect a child from the very thing the child might be born for. He resolved to keep the boy from ever seeing the things that might turn his mind toward the spiritual life. He would keep him from seeing suffering. So the young prince was raised by tradition in pleasure palaces, most likely at a place called Kapilavastu, the seat of the Shakya. And these were not just comfortable homes, they were, in the telling, deliberately constructed worlds of delight, designed to enchant every sense and to screen out every shadow. There were gardens kept always in bloom, there was music, there was beauty arranged at every turn, and, crucially, there was a kind of careful, gentle censorship of reality itself. The old and the sick were kept from the prince's sight. Anything wilting or fading was quietly removed before he could see it. He grew up, in other words, inside a curated paradise, a place where, as far as he could tell, no one ever aged, no one ever sickened, no one ever died, and sorrow simply did not exist. Imagine that for a moment. Imagine being raised so carefully that you reach adulthood having never once seen a grey hair, never seen a person in pain, never seen a body laid still. Imagine how thin and fragile such a happiness would have to be built as it was on never looking too closely at anything. In time, he grew into a young man, and he married a woman named Yasodhara, and together they had a son, whom they named Rahula. There is a small, poignant detail attached to that name, which I will offer to you lightly, because the old tellers did not entirely agree on it. The name Rahula is sometimes glossed as meaning something like fetter, a binding, a tie, a chain. Whether the prince himself felt his beloved son as a kind of tender chain holding him to his old life, no one can say for certain, and we should be careful not to make him colder than he was. But the detail has lingered in the tradition for a reason. A man who senses somewhere underneath his comfort that he is being called towards something vast and difficult might well feel the dearest things in his life, a wife, a newborn son, as both a joy and a binding, both a home and a thing that holds him in place. Most of us know that feeling in some smaller form. The things we love most are also the things hardest to walk away from. And then, by tradition, came the moment the whole careful structure broke. It came not through some great catastrophe, but through the simplest possible thing. Through the prince, now a grown man, going out for ordinary rides through the world beyond the palace walls. On these chariot rides, the story says, he saw 4 things. And these 4 sights, ordinary as they would be to you or me, struck him like 4 quiet hammer blows because he had been so carefully kept from ever seeing them before. The first sight was an old man, bent, frail, worn down by years, and the prince, who had never seen old age, asked what this was, and he was told, gently, perhaps reluctantly, that this is what happens to everyone, that all bodies, given enough time, come to this. That his own body and the bodies of everyone he loved were quietly traveling toward exactly this. Hold that for a moment, the way he must have. A man who believed until that day that youth simply went on, suddenly understanding that it does not. The second sight was a sick man. A person racked with illness, their body betraying them, their ease gone. And again the prince asked, and again he was told, this too comes to everyone. No comfort, no privilege, no palace wall can keep illness out forever. The body is a fragile thing, and sooner or later, in some form, it falters. The third sight was the heaviest. It was a corpse, a body being carried to its funeral, still and lifeless, with mourners walking behind. And the prince, who had been raised in a world where death had been edited out entirely, finally looked upon the plain fact that all of us spend our whole lives quietly knowing and quietly avoiding, that this life ends, that every person he had ever loved, and he himself, would one day be exactly this. Still. Finished. Carried away. The careful paradise of his childhood could not survive that sight. You cannot unsee a thing like that. Once you have truly understood that everything you love will pass, the brightly painted walls of any pleasure palace begin to look very thin indeed. And then came the fourth sight, and it was different from the others. The first 3 had shown him the problem: age, sickness, death, the unavoidable shape of every life. But the 4th showed him something like a possibility. He saw a wandering ascetic, a holy man, a seeker, someone who had left the ordinary world behind and gone out with nothing in search of an answer to exactly the suffering the prince had just glimpsed. And there was in this figure a kind of calm, a composure that did not depend on palace walls or guarded gardens. Here was a person who had looked the hard truths full in the face and had not been destroyed by them, who had instead gone looking for a way through. And something in the prince recognized that as his own road. This is the moment the tradition calls the Great Renunciation. Siddhartha, by these accounts about 29 years old, made the decision his father had spent a lifetime trying to prevent. He resolved to leave the palace, the comfort, the certain future as a ruler. To leave, hardest of all, his sleeping wife Yasodhara and his infant son Rahula. The old stories linger on that final night. The prince, looking one last time upon his sleeping family, not waking them, slipping out into the dark, trading a life of guaranteed comfort for a life of uncertain searching. We do not need to decide whether every detail happened just so. What matters, what the story is trying to give us, is the shape of a choice that almost no one would make. A man who had everything the world calls success, walking away from all of it, because he had finally seen that none of it could answer the one question that mattered. What do we do about the fact that everything we love slips away? He did not yet have the answer. That night, slipping out past the gardens kept always in bloom, he had only the question and the courage to follow it. The answer, the thing he would spend the next years of his life, his body, and his whole searching mind to find, was still ahead of him, out in the dark, beyond the walls. And here, for now, we will pause. Let the prince walk out into his long night, and let yourself rest in yours. Take a slow, deep breath, let it come in gently, and let it go even more gently. Notice, if you can, the simple weight of your own body wherever it rests, how it is held, how it is supported, how little it has to do right now. Notice the quiet in the room. Notice that for this moment, there is nothing to figure out and nothing to decide. You do not have to remember any of what you have heard. You do not have to follow the prince any further than you wish. You can simply lie here, breathing, held by the dark, as the story waits patiently for you. And when you are ready, in no hurry at all, we will continue together. Welcome to Relaxing Subjects. Tonight, we are going to slow down together and spend some time with one of the oldest and gentlest bodies of wisdom the human family has ever set down, the core teachings of the Buddha. We will walk through them slowly, without hurry, mostly through stories, the way they were first carried from one person to another in the quiet of an evening. You do not need to know anything about Buddhism to listen tonight. You do not need to believe anything or remember anything or understand it all by morning. There is nothing here to study and nothing here to pass. There is only a voice and the dark and an old story unfolding at the pace of your own breathing. If you would like, you might share in a comment what time it is where you are and the name of the place you are listening from. It is a small, kind thing to know that someone in one part of the world is settling down to rest, just as someone far away is too. But even that is entirely up to you. Right now, take a slow, deep breath. Let it fill you without effort, and let it leave without force. Wherever you are, however you are lying, let yourself settle in. Let the bed take your weight. Let the day, with all it asked of you, begin to loosen its grip. Thank you for being here. Let us begin. There is something many of us do, especially at night, that we rarely say out loud. We lie down, finally still, finally allowed to stop, and the mind does not stop with us. It keeps working. It defends. It rehearses old conversations, polishes old grievances, guards some idea of who we are and who we should have been. We lie in the dark, tired to the bone, and some part of us is still standing watch over a self it is afraid to lose. If that is you tonight, you are not broken, and you are not alone. This restless, defending mind is not a personal flaw. It is one of the oldest experiences there is, and the story we are about to enter is, in a sense, the story of one man who lay down with exactly that mind and slowly, patiently learned to let it rest. So let me give you the image. The whole story turns toward the prize at the far end of the long night, so you can carry it gently with you as we go. Picture, much later than where we are now, a man so thin from years of self-denial that you could see the shape of his spine through the front of his belly. A starving man who has tried to conquer his own body and failed. And picture, held out to him, a simple bowl of milk rice. Warm, ordinary, nourishing. He takes it. And in the taking, in that small act of accepting kindness instead of punishing himself, something opens. He finds what he will later call the middle way. And the freedom he eventually reaches has the simplest name of all. The word for it means, quite literally, to blow out a flame. Not to be destroyed, not to vanish, just the quiet going out of a fire that has been burning too long and too hot. Hold that image lightly. A flame gently blown out. We are walking all night towards that peace. But every river has a source, and ours begins with a child. The man we are speaking of was a real person who walked this earth. His name was Siddhartha Gautama, of a clan called the Shakya, which is why he is sometimes called Shakya Muni, the sage of the Shakyas. That is not his name, but a title. The way we might say someone is the wise one of such and such a place. When exactly he lived, even the careful scholars do not fully agree, and there is no need for us to settle it tonight. Many place him in roughly the 5th century before the Common Era. Some hold to older traditional dates, some to a shorter, later reckoning. The honest answer is that the experts genuinely disagree, and we can let that be, the way you might let an old family date stay a little blurred and love the person all the same. What we do have, standing in the ground to this day, is a stone pillar raised long after his death by an emperor named Ashoka, more than 2 centuries later, at a place called Lumbini, in what is now Nepal, near the border with India. That pillar names the spot as the birthplace of the Buddha. It is among the oldest, hardest pieces of evidence we have, a real place, a real stone, a real man born there. His father was Suddhodana, often called a king, though it is closer to the truth to call him a chosen leader, a Rajan of a small republic, the head of his people, rather than a monarch in a great palace, as we might imagine one. His mother was Maya, sometimes called Maya Devi. By tradition, she died only 7 days after his birth, and so the child was raised by her sister, his aunt, a woman named Mahapajapati Gotami, who would become important again, much later, in the story. And the name they gave him, Siddhartha, carries a quiet hope inside it. It means, more or less, one who has accomplished his aim, one who will arrive where he is meant to go. Now here the story passes into what tradition holds, rather than what we can prove. And we will say so plainly as we go, because the honest telling is part of the comfort. Tradition tells of a prophecy spoken over the infant. The child, it was said, would become one of 2 things, either a great king ruling the world, or a great holy man awakening it. And his father, loving him and wanting a son who would rule, made a choice that many a loving parent might understand. He decided to give the boy only the first path. He would build a life so full of beauty and ease that the child would never feel the pull toward anything else. So Siddhartha grew up, the story says, inside pleasure palaces at a place called Kapilavastu, surrounded by every comfort, every delight, the seasons themselves arranged so the gardens were always in bloom and nothing withered where he could see it. Anything old, anything sick, anything broken or sorrowful was kept beyond the walls, out of his sight. He married a woman named Yasodhara, and in time they had a son whom they named Rahula. He had, by every measure the world uses, a complete and golden life. And yet, you can build a wall around a garden, but you cannot build one around a human heart forever. The story tells that on a few rare journeys beyond the palace, the prince finally saw the things his father had hidden. These are remembered as the 4 sights, and they are simple, and they are the things every one of us meets eventually. First, an old man, bent and frail, and Siddhartha learned that youth does not last. Then a sick man suffering, and he learned that the body can fail. Then a corpse carried to its rest, and he learned, truly learned, that death comes for everyone, even for him, even for those he loved. 3 quiet sorrows that his whole life had been arranged to hide. And then a 4th sight, different from the others. A wandering ascetic, a man who owned nothing, who had walked away from ordinary life to search for an answer to exactly these sorrows. A man who, in the face of all that decay, seemed strangely, deeply at peace. Something in the prince broke open then and would not close again. He had everything, and he had seen that everything ends. He could not unsee it. And so, at about the age of 29, he made the choice the prophecy had named, the choice we call the Great Renunciation. He looked one last time at his sleeping wife, his sleeping son, the soft and certain comfort of the only life he had ever known, and he chose the other road. Not because he despised what he had, but because none of it could answer the one question that now would not let him sleep. And so we have already walked with him to the edge of his old life and watched him step beyond the walls. That is enough for now. Let us not hurry him toward what he finds. Let the search be still ahead of him, out there in the dark. And let us rest here a while, on this side of the answer, where we are warm and held and asked for nothing. So let us pause again, take another slow, deep breath, even slower than the last. Feel the air arrive and feel it leave, and feel how your body already knows how to do this without any help from you. Notice, if you would like, how something in your shoulders or your jaw or your hands may have softened just a little since we began. And if it has not, that is perfectly all right, too. There is nothing to achieve here. The prince is walking through his long night, and you are lying safely in yours, and neither of you needs to reach the end tonight. You do not have to hold any of this. You can let the names and the places drift like leaves on dark water, and keep only the warmth of the voice. Rest here. Breathe. And when you are ready, in no hurry at all, we will go on together, out into the dark, to see what he finds. He walked out into a world he had never been allowed to see. The roads were not what the palace had taught him roads were. They were narrow and unpredictable and full of the kind of sounds that do not quite become silence, even in the deepest hours of the night. He had no possessions of consequence. He had the question, which was possession enough. He was looking for someone or something that could explain why old age comes, why sickness arrives without invitation, why death is not a distant rumor, but the ground on which every human life is built. He had seen all 3 on those chariot rides. He had also seen the wandering ascetic, moving through the world with a kind of calm the prince did not yet understand. And so he went looking for that calm in the only way the world of his time offered a serious seeker. He joined the forest renunciants, the wanderers, the men who believed that the way through suffering was to strip everything away. For a time, he studied with teachers. The tradition names 2 of them, Alara Kalama and Uddaka Ramaputta, and says he mastered what they taught quickly enough that each offered to share the leading of their community. He declined. What they offered was real, but he felt incomplete. It addressed the mind, stilled it, brought it to very quiet and high states of concentration. But when he rose from those states, the question remained. The world was still as it was. Old age, sickness, and death had not been explained. They had only been temporarily outrun. And so he went further. He found 5 companions, 5 serious, disciplined men who shared his search. And with them, he turned toward the most demanding practice available, severe asceticism. The logic was not irrational if you understand the world as those practitioners understood it. They believed that the body was the problem, that its cravings, its hungers, its persistent demands for comfort and pleasure were the chains that kept the spirit bound. If you could conquer the body, starve it, discipline it, reduce it to almost nothing, then the spirit, the deeper awareness, might finally be free. It was a rigorous, committed, deeply sincere belief, and it produced rigorous, committed, deeply sincere suffering. The accounts of these 6 years, as the tradition has handed them to us, are unflinching in their detail. He reduced his food to almost nothing, a single grain of rice, a single sesame seed. He sat motionless for long hours under the full heat of the open sky. He held his breath until the pressure in his skull became a sound like wind. He endured the rain, the cold, the insects. The texts describe a young man so diminished by fasting that he could feel, when he placed his hand on his abdomen, the ridges of his spine through the skin of his belly. He could close his hand around one arm and feel almost nothing between his fingers. This is tradition speaking, remembered across centuries and told in the way that sacred biography is always told, with an intensity meant to honor the depth of the effort. We do not need to hold every detail as a documented record to feel what it is pointing at. What it is pointing at is this: he tried everything. He did not hold back. He gave 6 years of his life and very nearly his body to the belief that the answer was in there somewhere, past the threshold of endurance. And the answer did not come. Or rather, something else came in its place. A deepening stillness, yes, and states of concentration that were genuinely profound. But not freedom. Not the explanation he had walked out of the palace to find. There is a moment the tradition places at the end of these 6 years. It is a small moment, quiet. It involves a young woman from a nearby village, a bowl, and something warm to eat. Her name was Sujata. The accounts say she had been making an offering, milk rice, a simple dish of rice cooked slowly in milk until it becomes soft and nourishing, and she encountered the ascetic sitting beneath a tree. He was by that point barely recognizable as the person he had been, thin in a way that had gone past discipline into depletion. She offered him the bowl, and he took it. He ate. This is the moment. It does not look like much from the outside. A man sitting under a tree eating a bowl of rice, but inside that single act, everything was turning, because when he accepted that food, when he let nourishment back in, he was conceding something that his 6 years of rigorous asceticism had not yet admitted. He was conceding that the body is not the enemy, that starving it did not answer the question any more than filling it had answered the question in the palace, that the suffering he was seeking to understand was not something you could cut out of yourself by removing all comfort. It ran deeper than that, and it would have to be understood differently. The 5 companions who had walked alongside him, who had witnessed his years of self-mortification and respected him for it, saw what he did and drew the obvious conclusion. He had given up. He had softened. He had turned back toward pleasure and abandoned the search. They left him. They walked away, a small group of serious men who had decided he no longer deserved their company or their time. He sat alone. The bowl was empty. The companions were gone. He had failed by the standards of every path he had so far followed. The royal ease of the palace, the meditative heights with his teachers, the brutal austerity with the five. None of it had done what he came out into the world to find done. And in that silence, something began to clarify. He was remembering, the tradition says, a moment from his childhood, a time when he had sat quietly under a tree during a ploughing festival and fallen naturally, without effort, into a deep and peaceful state of meditation. Not forced, not earned through pain. Not the result of deprivation or discipline in its harshest form, just still, present, aware. And in that memory a question opened. What if that way is the way? What if presence, not punishment, is the door? The understanding that formed from this is what Buddhism calls the middle way, Majjhima Patipada, the middle path. Not the palace, not the forest floor of near starvation, not indulgence and not self-torture. The path that runs between them, neither grasping at pleasure nor declaring war on the body that feels it, a path of balance, of clarity, of gentle and sustained attention. Like a lute string, the tradition offers, and this image is given as the Buddha's own, a lute string too tight will snap, and a lute string too loose will produce no sound. The right tension, held steady, makes music. The middle way is the right tension. This is not a compromise, it is not a settling for something halfway between two extremes. It is a recognition that both extremes are, in their different ways, forms of the same error. The belief that the answer is in the management of the body, whether that management takes the form of feeding or starving. The error is in looking to external conditions for what can only be found in understanding. And understanding requires a mind that is clear, not maddened by excess in either direction. He had found the map, or at least its orientation. He still did not know what was at the center, but he knew now which road he was on. He rose from where he was sitting. He bathed, if the accounts are to be followed. He walked, and he came eventually to a place beside a river near a town called Bodh Gaya, where a particular tree spread its branches wide over the ground. It was a pipal tree. Ficus religiosa is the name given to its species. A fig tree, broad and ancient, with heart-shaped leaves that catch even the smallest stir of air and turn it into a constant, soft trembling. He spread a mat of grass beneath it, and he sat down. The resolve he made, as the tradition holds it, was total. He would not rise from that spot, not for food, not for shelter, not for the passage of days, until he had understood what he came into the world to understand. He would sit until awakening, or until his body gave out beneath him. That was the entirety of the choice. What followed, in the tradition's telling, is given to us in the form of a night that contained 3 watches and everything that can happen to a mind pressing itself to the edge of what is knowable. Mara came. In the Buddhist tradition, Mara is the name for the force that keeps beings bound to the cycle of craving and rebirth. Not exactly a devil in the way that word often lands in other traditions, but something closer to the personification of everything in the mind that resists waking up. Desire, fear, doubt, the pull of the familiar, the voice that says this is foolish, this cannot be done, you are not the one who does this. Mara came with armies, the texts say, and with his daughters and with arguments and with the full force of the world's resistance to what was trying to happen under that tree. And the practitioner beneath the tree, who was not yet the Buddha, who was still the seeker, responded to Mara's challenge with a gesture, a single, simple movement. He reached down and touched the earth. This is the Bhumisparsha Mudra, the earth-touching gesture. The right hand lowering, the fingertips meeting the ground. It appears in more statues, more paintings, more devotional images of the Buddha than perhaps any other single pose. The gesture calls the earth itself as witness. Witness to every act of generosity, every moment of effort, every life of practice that had led to this one. The earth knew the earth would confirm it. This seat was earned. Mara, by tradition, withdrew. And then, in the third watch of the night, as the texts have it, something gave way that had never given way before in quite this way. The understanding came, not as a vision, not as a voice, but as a knowing, a clear, complete, unobstructed seeing of the way things actually are, how suffering arises, why craving perpetuates itself. The chain of conditions by which one moment of ignorance seeds the next, and the next until the whole structure is seen and, in the seeing, released. When the sky began to pale toward morning, he was no longer the seeker. He was the Buddha. That word. It is worth sitting with it for a moment, here in the dark. It comes from the Pali and Sanskrit root Buddh, to wake up, to know, to be fully aware. It means, most simply, the awakened one. Not a god, not a supernatural being who had always existed outside of time. A person who had woken up to the nature of reality in a way most people have not. A title, not a name. As though we were to call someone the understood, or the cleared, or the opened. Buddha is what happens to Siddhartha Gautama of the Shakya clan when, under a particular fig tree on a particular night in a particular ancient town, he sees through to the other side of the question he could not stop asking. Shakya Muni, sage of the Shakyas, the awakened one. Both names pointing at the same man, now sitting quietly as the dawn came in. He stayed near that place for a while. The accounts speak of a hesitation, a wondering whether what he had understood could even be communicated, whether the rest of the world, going about its daily rounds of hunger and hope and grief and small satisfactions, could hold what he had seen without being lost in it. It is a very human hesitation, and whether or not you take it as historical record, it has the ring of something true. There are understandings that feel, in the first moments of their arrival, like they belong to you alone, like language would only reduce them. But then he walked, toward the north, toward Varanasi, the great city of temples and learning on the Ganges. Near Varanasi there was a park, a deer park at a place called Sarnath. And there, and this is where something new comes into the world, he found his 5 former companions. They had left him in disgust. They had watched him accept the bowl of milk rice and decided he had given up. But when they saw him walking toward them across the park, something in the way he moved stopped them. They had planned, by some accounts, to ignore him, to maintain the slight, to let him pass without the deference they would have offered a true seeker. But they could not quite manage it. Something was different about him. Something had changed that they could not name yet, but could not pretend was not there. He sat with them, and he spoke. What he said to them, what he offered in that deer park at Sarnath to 5 people who had recently walked away from him, is the teaching that has never stopped being taught in the 2,500 years since that afternoon. This discourse is called the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, the setting in motion the wheel of the Dhamma, the first turning of the wheel. The eight-spoked wheel, the Dharma chakra, has been from that time to this one of the central symbols of Buddhism. You see it on the flag of India. You see it carved in stone at Sarnath itself, where Ashoka later raised a pillar to mark the spot. The wheel was already a symbol of sovereignty and cosmic order in the world the Buddha inhabited, but now it became something else as well, the symbol of a teaching that rolls on, that does not stop, that reaches outward in all directions from a still center. 8 spokes, 8 parts of the path he was about to describe, and the wheel, not as a cage, but as a vehicle, something that moves, that carries, that takes you somewhere you could not have walked to on your own. Let us rest here for a moment. Take a slow breath in and let it go in whatever way feels right for your body tonight. You do not have to understand everything that has been said. You do not need to hold the names or the dates or the sequence of events. The part that matters is not the information. It is the sense of a search and of something opening. A man who tried everything and failed at everything, and then found in the failure the precise shape of what he had been looking for. That is the part to rest inside of if you rest inside anything at all. Notice your breath, notice your body lying still, notice how the room or the air around you has its own quality right now, its own particular quiet, its own temperature, its own small sounds. You are not required to name any of it. You can just be in it, the way a leaf is in the water it floats on. Nothing to do, nowhere to be. The wheel is set in motion and it will still be turning when you wake. Breathe. And when the rest has settled into you a little more, take all the time you need. We will go on. Now, what did he actually say? He said, first, that there are 2 extremes a serious practitioner should not pursue. One is the pursuit of sensual pleasure, which he knew from his own life, from the pleasure palaces and the certainty of youth, to be something that satisfies temporarily but does not answer the deeper question. And the other is the pursuit of self-mortification, which he knew from 6 years of near starvation to be painful and unproductive, and not, in the end, any closer to understanding than the silk cushions had been. Between these 2, he said, is a middle way. And then he described it. But before the path, he offered something that had to come first, a diagnosis. Because if you do not understand what is wrong, a prescription is just a list of things to do. He was about to offer the prescription. First came the diagnosis, the 4 noble truths. Katari Aryasakani, 4 truths worthy of the noble ones, of those who have looked at life without flinching. Not 4 opinions, not 4 beliefs to be adopted out of faith, but 4 observations about the nature of experience. The kind of observations that, if you sit quietly enough and look honestly enough, you can confirm for yourself without taking anyone's word for it. The first is dukkha. This is the word that has caused more misunderstanding of Buddhism in more languages and more centuries than possibly any other single term. It is usually translated as suffering. Life is suffering. That is the sentence you have probably encountered, if you have encountered Buddhism at all, more often than almost any other. And there is something true in it, but only something. Because the word dukkha is far more precise than suffering, and the precision is where the teaching actually lives. The root of the word in Pali connects to the image of a wheel, specifically a wheel whose axle hole is slightly off-center. Not broken, not shattered, just slightly off. So the wheel turns and turns, and mostly it works, and you can go about your day and get where you are going. But there is a small, persistent wobble in the ride, a friction that never quite resolves, a quality of not quite rightness that you may not even consciously notice until someone points it out. And then, once pointed out, you cannot unfeel it. That is dukkha. It is not only the dramatic suffering, the grief, the illness, the loss, the moments when life breaks open and everything hurts. It includes those, yes, but it also includes the subtle, quiet sense of unsatisfactoriness that runs beneath even pleasant experience. The beautiful meal that ends, the good day that closes, the conversation with someone you love that eventually has to stop. The moments that are genuinely lovely but carry somewhere in them the awareness that they will not last and that the ending is already folded into the having. The slight wobble in every wheel that is made of changing parts. Dukkha is usually divided in the tradition into three kinds. The obvious kind, pain, grief, the straightforward forms of suffering that no one disputes. The subtler kind, the suffering built into the fact that everything pleasant eventually changes and ends. And the subtlest kind of all, a kind of existential pervasiveness, the condition of being a being who clings to things that cannot be held, who reaches for permanence in a world made entirely of impermanence. This third kind is the one that the single word suffering cannot hold, because you can be having, by any external measure, a genuinely good time, your health is fine, your people are near, the evening is warm, and still there is, somewhere in it, this almost imperceptible wobble, this slight off-centerness. The wheel is turning, it turns beautifully, but the axle hole is not quite right. Now, here is the thing that nearly every popular summary of Buddhism leaves out. The first noble truth is not the only noble truth, it is the diagnosis. And a diagnosis on its own, without the rest of what the physician has to say, sounds like very bad news. If a doctor sat down across from you and said only, "You are unwell," and then stood up and left the room, you would be distressed. But the physician of the mind, which is how the commentarial tradition explicitly frames the Buddha in these four truths, does not stop at the diagnosis. There are 4 steps to what he says. And the third step is the one that changes everything. Diagnosis. Dukkha, the unsatisfactoriness woven through conditioned existence. That is the first truth. Cause, samudaya. The arising, the origin. What is the origin of dukkha? Tanha. Craving, thirst. The Pali word tanha means literally thirst, the desperate reaching for something to quench, a thirst that in ordinary life can never quite be quenched, because the things we reach for keep running out. The teaching identifies 3 specific forms of this craving: craving for sensual pleasure, for the good taste, the warm body, the comfortable feeling, craving for existence and becoming, for things to keep going, for the pleasant situation to persist, for the self to continue and expand and be confirmed, and craving for non-existence, a third and sometimes overlooked form, which is the desire to escape, to have certain experiences end, to not be rather than to be, in whatever way that wish arises. These 3 together are the cause, the second truth. Prognosis, nirodha. Cessation, the ending. This is the third truth, and in many ways the most important one, and also, as noted, the most overlooked. The third truth says the cessation of craving is possible. The unsatisfactoriness that runs through experience has a cause, and causes can be addressed. This is not wishful thinking, it is the hinge on which the entire teaching turns. If the first 2 truths were all there was, Buddhism would be a very grim religion, a careful taxonomy of why everything hurts, followed by silence. But the third truth opens a door that the first 2 truths establish the need for. Cessation is possible. The fire can go out. Prescription, magga. The path. The fourth truth names the path that leads to that cessation. And that path is the Eightfold Path. The 8 spokes of the wheel that was set in motion that afternoon at the deer park in Sarnath. The medical model here is not accidental, it is explicit in the commentarial tradition. in the way teachers have explained these four truths for 25 centuries. The Buddha is presented as a physician, not of the body, but of the mind. A physician who examines, identifies the illness, assesses whether it can be treated, and then prescribes the treatment. The four truths follow that exact structure: illness, cause, possibility of cure, the cure itself. And the physician says the cure is real. The third truth is the hopeful one. Life as ordinarily lived involves this unsatisfactoriness, yes, but as ordinarily lived is not as it must always be. The craving can release. The wheel can find its center. The wobble does not have to be forever. Let us sit with that for a moment before we move on. There is something very specific and very tender being offered here, and it is worth letting it land rather than passing through it quickly. The teaching is not saying life is suffering, accept it. It is not resignation. It is not the instruction to simply endure. It is saying, here is a phenomenon, here is its cause, here is evidence that it can be addressed, and here is the way to address it. That is a completely different posture. That is the posture of a mind that has looked at the difficulty of human experience and not turned away, and not been broken by what it saw, and found, on the other side of the looking, something that looks very much like a way through. Take a breath. Let that settle. The room is still. Your body is still. The words can drift through you like warmth, and you do not need to hold any one of them. Just the sense of a door opening. And now let us open it further. The path itself, the fourth truth, the prescription the physician writes, has 8 parts. The Noble Eightfold Path, Arya Atangika Magga. And here again, right at the beginning, there is a translation choice that opens the whole thing differently depending on which word you use. The word in Pali that names each part of the path is sama. Right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. 8 rights. But sama does not mean right in the sense of correct versus incorrect, following the rules, doing it properly. Sama means something closer to complete, whole, harmonious, in accordance with the full nature of things. A sama speech is not just speech that follows a code, it is speech that arises from a mind that sees clearly and from a heart that cares and from an awareness of the effects of words on the people who receive them. It is speech that is whole in all its dimensions at once. This matters because the 8 parts of the path are not a ladder. They are not step 1, then step 2, then step 3, in a sequence where you complete each one before moving to the next. They are 8 spokes of a wheel, all meeting at the center. You work with all of them together. Each one supports the others. Right? Mindfulness, for example, deepens your ability to act with right intention, and right action creates the conditions in which right concentration can arise. And right view, seeing things clearly, is both the beginning of the path and a quality that deepens all the way to its end. They are not a staircase, they are a living structure, a web, all of it turning together. The 8 are traditionally grouped into 3 trainings. 3 ways of cultivating the whole person. Not just the mind, not just the behavior, not just the inner life, but all of them at once. The first training is panna, wisdom. This includes right view and right intention. Right view is the understanding of the way things are, the 4 noble truths, the nature of impermanence, the arising of suffering, and its end. It is the seeing that orients everything else, and right intention is the orientation of the heart that flows from that seeing, the intention toward renunciation rather than grasping, toward kindness rather than ill will, toward non-harming rather than cruelty. Wisdom here is not only what you know, it is what knowing does to the quality of your wanting, The second training is sila, ethical conduct. This includes right speech, right action, and right livelihood, how you speak, how you act, how you earn your living and move through the world in its most practical dimensions, the actual choices you make in actual days. This training recognizes that the inner life and the outer life are not separate. A mind that is cultivating clarity cannot do so while the body it inhabits is spending its days causing harm. The ethical training is not an external code imposed from outside. It arises naturally from wisdom, because a mind that sees clearly the connection between its actions and the suffering or ease of others cannot, in good conscience, go on acting carelessly. Sila and Panna support each other. The clearer you see, the more naturally you act with care. The more you act with care, the cleaner the conditions in which clarity can deepen. The third training is samadhi. Mental cultivation, concentration, the development of the mind itself. This includes right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. Right effort is the sustained, balanced application of energy, neither the desperate straining of those 6 years under the harsh sun, nor the drift of a mind that has given up and lets everything slide. The middle tension of the lute string, again. Right mindfulness is the quality of clear, present, non-judgmental attention, the quality that has become, in our own time, the subject of an enormous amount of interest and investigation far beyond the walls of any monastery. And right concentration is the deepening of the mind's capacity to settle, to rest, to become still and clear and unified in a way that ordinary distracted daily life does not tend to produce by itself. Together, these three trainings address the whole of a human life, not just what you think, not just what you feel, not just what you do, all of it woven together, each thread supporting the others, each development in one area nourishing the others in turn. The path is not a punishment. It is not the ascetic's forest floor brought indoors. It is the lute string at its right tension, engaged, alive, capable of music. And the music, the third truth says, is real. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a slow, deep breath. Notice what has begun to settle in you. The way the body grows a little heavier, a little quieter, as the mind receives something it has been offered without being asked to do anything with it. The three trainings have been named. The path has been laid out, spoke by spoke, not as a ladder you must climb, but as a wheel, whole and turning, each part supporting every other. Wisdom and ethical conduct and the cultivation of the mind. Panna, sila, samadhi. Complete, harmonious, mutually sustaining. When you are ready, we will continue together. There is still more the teaching offers tonight, and all of it is given gently. Let us turn now towards something the Buddha called the 3 marks of existence, the tilakkhana. 3 qualities, he said, that characterize all conditioned things. All things that arise. All things that depend on conditions to be what they are. Not just human things, not just painful things, but every formed thing in experience, without exception. The first mark you have already met tonight, even if not by its name. Anicca, impermanence. This is not a difficult concept to understand. Understanding it takes a moment. Truly receiving it, living in a way that is settled within it rather than constantly flinching away from it. That is a different work, a longer work, the work perhaps of a lifetime. Everything that arises passes. Every sensation that comes will go. Every thought that forms will dissolve. Every body that breathes will one day stop breathing. Every meeting will eventually be a parting. Every pleasure will end, not because something has gone wrong, but because ending is woven into the nature of conditioned things as completely as beginning is. The teaching does not offer this as a grief. It offers it as a fact that, if received openly, has the power to change the quality of every moment you are in. There is a particular kind of suffering that is not the pain of the moment itself, but the insistence that the moment should not end. The grip, the silent argument against what is already moving on. Anicca, the teaching says, is simply the nature of things. And when you stop fighting that nature, something in you can rest that has never been able to rest before. Think of the way you sometimes hold a pleasant evening just a little too tightly. The dinner is good, the company warm, and somewhere underneath the enjoyment there is a faint contraction. A wish that this should not change, a reaching forward into preservation as though by some internal effort you could freeze the warmth in place. And in that reaching the evening is not quite fully yours. You are half inside it and half outside it, trying to save it. Anicca says, the evening is fully yours only when you are fully inside it, with no project of preservation running underneath. The warmth is real. The passing is real. Both can be true at once, and the moment you can hold both, something loosens. The second mark is dukkha, which you have already met, and at length. Unsatisfactoriness. The subtle out-of-jointness running through even the pleasant experiences of a conditioned life, like the faint rumble of the off-center axle that you eventually stop noticing, but that never quite goes away. Dukkha as a mark of existence is a slightly wider claim than dukkha as the first noble truth. It is saying not just that there is suffering in life, but that anything built on unstable foundations carries instability in itself. Anything pleasant that depends on conditions will shift when the conditions shift. That faint trace of unsatisfactoriness in even our contentment is not a sign we have done something wrong. It is simply the texture of the conditioned. But the third mark is the one the Buddha's contemporaries found most radical, the one that, even now, takes the longest to sit with, anatta, non-self. Let us approach it carefully, because it is easy to misunderstand in either direction. Anatta does not say that you do not exist. It does not say that you are nothing, that your experiences are not happening, that the person sitting with this narration tonight has no reality. That is not what the teaching is. And yet the teaching is genuinely surprising, genuinely quietly world-rearranging. What anatta says is that there is no permanent, unchanging, independent self underneath all of this experience. There is no fixed soul at the center, no unchanging essence that you have carried continuously from your earliest moment to this one, and that will, unchanged, carry on. What we call the self is a process, a river, not a stone, a pattern of changing elements in constant flux, not a single solid thing that merely passes through experiences like a traveler passing through towns. The Buddha's culture had a word for the unchanging soul, Atman. The great Vedic and Brahmanical tradition of his day taught that beneath the surface of personality and sensation there was an eternal self, Atman, identical at its deepest with Brahman, the ground of all being. The self that survives death, transmigrates and continues. The Buddha's teaching of anatta was a direct and careful departure from this. Not a casual rejection, but a considered one, arising from close observation of actual experience. What, he asked, do you actually find when you look for this fixed self? When you sit quietly and search with care and patience for the unchanging soul, the permanent core, the thing that is doing all the experiencing, what do you actually encounter? You find experience. But you do not find a stable experiencer behind it. You find sensation, perception, thought, emotion, awareness. All of it moving, all of it arising and passing, none of it staying still long enough to be pinned down as the permanent self it was supposed to be. The teaching describes this in terms of the 5 aggregates, the skandhas. 5 groups of phenomena that together make up what we call a person. Form, the body, the physical. Sensation, the bare quality of pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral that accompanies every experience. Perception, the recognition and categorization of what is encountered. Mental formations, the enormous range of mental and emotional activity. Intention, attention, habit, mood, the whole churning life of the mind. And consciousness, the quality of awareness itself, which arises in dependence on the other 4, and which also changes and is not a separate, fixed witness standing apart from the process. These 5 are not a self. They are processes. They are more like a fire than like a stone. The fire is real. It burns. It gives warmth and light, but there is no fire substance sitting at its center. The fire is the burning. And when the conditions for burning cease, the fire goes out. It does not go somewhere else as a little flame soul. It simply ceases. This is why nirvana, which we will return to shortly, is described as nibbana, the blowing out, the extinguishing of a flame. Now, you may be thinking, but something persists. I remember yesterday. I am the same person who began this evening. Surely there is continuity. Yes. The teaching does not deny continuity. A river is not the same water from moment to moment. The water that was at the bend in the river this morning is now miles downstream. And yet the river is the same river. It has continuity, character, a recognizable form, not because there is a fixed river soul, but because there is a continuous flowing process, each moment arising in dependence on the one before it, carrying forward the shape and quality of what came before. You are like that. What continues is not a fixed self. What continues is a stream of causally connected experience, each moment arising from and conditioned by the one before it, carrying the accumulated patterns of thought and action and habit, what the teaching calls karma, forward into the next moment. Not a soul traveling, a process propagating. And here is the tender part, the part the teaching offers, not as a grief, but as a liberation. Most of the suffering we examined under dukkha, most of the craving and aversion, and the grinding anxiety of a defended life, arises in defense of something that is not quite there in the way we imagine it is. We suffer enormously protecting and promoting and securing a fixed self that turns out, on close examination, to be a river, not a stone. We argue and grasp and fear and resent in service of an entity that is, at its deepest, a flowing process rather than a fortress. Anatta is not a threat to you. It is more like the discovery that you have been standing outside a house in the rain, carefully guarding the door, when all along you could have simply come inside. Let us sit with that for a moment. The 3 marks together form a coherent picture. Things are impermanent, anicca. Because they are impermanent and conditioned, they carry unsatisfactoriness, dukkha. And the self that feels itself to be suffering is not the fixed, solid thing it took itself to be, anatta. These 3 are not separate doctrines bolted together. They illuminate each other, each one deepens the others. And they are offered not to dishearten, but to orient. Once you see clearly where you are, you can move differently. The physician must first know the patient's condition. Only then can the right medicine do its work. Now let us follow the deepest thread of the teaching, the one that runs underneath the 4 noble truths and the 3 marks both. The one the Buddha called paticcasamuppada, dependent origination. In Pali, paticcasamuppada, sometimes translated as dependent arising or conditioned co-production. The principle, in its simplest form, is this: things arise in dependence on conditions. When this is, that is, from the arising of this that arises, When this ceases, that ceases. From the cessation of this, that ceases. It is perhaps the most elegant and the most quietly radical idea in the entire teaching, and it is also one of the most under-discussed in popular presentations of Buddhism, which tend to stop with the Four Noble Truths and not ask what is driving them from below. Dependent origination is the engine, the mechanism, the principle that explains why things are the way they are and why change is possible. Nothing in conditioned experience, the teaching says, arises independently. Nothing is self-caused. Nothing exists by its own power, out of nothing, requiring nothing else. Everything that is because other things are. A seed becomes a sprout because there is soil, water, warmth. Remove the conditions and the sprout does not arise. A thought arises because there is a mind, a set of previous experiences, an object of attention. A moment of suffering arises because there is craving meeting conditions in a particular way. This might sound at first merely like common sense. Of course, things depend on other things, we know that. But the teaching pushes deeper than common sense. The Buddha elaborated dependent origination as a chain of 12 links, a sequence showing precisely how suffering arises from its conditions and how it can be unwound. The chain begins with ignorance, avidya. Not ignorance in the sense of being uninformed about facts, but the deeper ignorance of not seeing clearly the three mark, not seeing impermanence, not seeing the nature of unsatisfactoriness, not seeing the processual nature of what we call self. This ignorance, this fundamental misperception of the nature of experience, is the first link, and it conditions everything that follows. From ignorance arise formations, sankhara, the accumulated tendencies, the habitual patterns of thought and intention laid down by previous action. Karma, the grooves worn into the river's channel by long years of water flowing. From formations arises consciousness, the awareness that takes shape conditioned by those patterns. From consciousness arise name and form, the complex of mental and physical phenomena that constitute an experience of the world. And so it continues through the 6 sense bases, through contact, through feeling, through craving, through clinging, through becoming, through birth, to the final link: aging, death, grief, lamentation, pain, distress, despair. The whole long arising of suffering traced back, link by link, to its root in ignorance. And here is where the teaching becomes genuinely hopeful. If suffering arises because of conditions, it can cease when those conditions cease. When ignorance ceases, formations cease. When formations cease, consciousness, shaped by those particular patterns, ceases. And so the chain unwinds, link by link, in the other direction. Not suffering arising, but suffering dissolving. Not a new world, not a supernatural event, but the natural consequence of removing the conditions that produced the difficulty in the first place. This is the deep logic behind the third noble truth. The one we said was the most hopeful and the most often skipped: nirodha, cessation. The teaching does not merely say that suffering happens. It says that suffering arises from conditions. And because it arises from conditions, it can cease when the conditions are addressed. The path, the Noble Eightfold Path, is the systematic addressing of those conditions. Wisdom to displace ignorance, ethical conduct to displace the heedless actions born of craving, mental cultivation to deepen and clarify the mind's capacity to see things as they are. The whole architecture holds together, and at the end of it, when craving ceases, when clinging ceases, when the fires of greed and hatred and delusion are, one by one, no longer fed, what remains is described by a word that we should sit with: nibbana. In Sanskrit, nirvana. From a root meaning to blow out, to extinguish, as you would extinguish a flame. not annihilation, not the snuffing out of a person into nothing. The word points to the extinguishing of the fires of greed, of hatred, of delusion, that have been burning and consuming and driving the restless, suffering, defending life. When those fires go out, what remains is not nothing. The texts describe it variously as peace, as stillness, as the unconditioned, as a freedom that is not the freedom of getting what you want, but the freedom of no longer being driven by want. The flame goes out, and what remains is not darkness. It is the room which was always there that the flame had been too bright to let you see. This is nirvana, not a place you go, not a paradise with particular geography, not the permanent continuation of the self you know, transported to better surroundings. The cessation of the craving and clinging and the structural conditions that produce the grinding of samsara, the round of arising and passing, life meeting suffering, suffering generating the karma of further clinging, further arising. When the chain of dependent origination is unwound at its root, when ignorance gives way to clear seeing, what is released is not a soul that flies somewhere. What is released is the condition for further arising. The fire goes out, and there is peace. The teaching preserves a careful distinction between nirvana experienced in a life still being lived, what is sometimes called nirvana, with remainder, the remainder being the living body and the remaining experiences of a life, and parinirvana, the final nirvana at death, with no conditions remaining for further arising. The Buddha's own death at Kushinagar is described as parinirvana, a complete cessation, a final blowing out. And what of karma? In early Buddhism, karma in Pali, is not fate. It is not a cosmic ledger of merit and demerit doled out by some external judge. The word itself, at its most precise, refers to intentional action, satana, volition. The quality of will and attention and intention behind what you do. When the teaching says that actions have consequences, it is pointing to the way that intentional action shapes the mind that performs it, shapes the conditions of experience going forward, shapes, through the logic of dependent origination, what will arise next. A generous act performed with genuine openness of heart is not merely nice, it is a condition for the arising of further openness. A resentful act, nursed and fed, grows the conditions for further resentment. The river carves its own channel. Karma is the deepest description of that process, the moral causality woven into the fabric of conditioned arising. This is why the path, the Eightfold Path, is not merely a set of ethical rules imposed from outside. It is a set of conditions deliberately cultivated because the teaching is certain about what conditions lead where. Wisdom, ethical care, a cultivated and settled mind. These are conditions for freedom, the way water and warmth and good soil are conditions for the tree. Follow the conditions for liberation, and liberation follows, not as a reward from outside, but as a natural consequence from within. Let us pause here. Take a slow, deep breath. Let the 12 links of the chain dissolve a little in your awareness. You do not need to hold them all. You do not need to remember the sequence. What matters tonight is simply this. Things arise from conditions, and conditions can change. The suffering that has arisen in your life has arisen from conditions, and conditions are not permanent. They are not fixed. They are not you. Notice what has softened in you. Notice the quiet. And when you are ready, we will continue together. We have been moving through the deep interior of the teaching, the map the physician made of the terrain of the suffering mind and the path toward its healing. The Four Noble Truths, the Noble Eightfold Path. The three marks of existence: dependent origination, karma as intention, nirvana as the blowing out of the fires. This is the teaching. This is what he brought back from beneath the Bodhi tree at Bodh Gaya and set in motion at the deer park near Sarnath in the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, when he turned to his 5 former companions and began to speak. And what he offered them was not a religion of rules handed down from above, not a cosmology requiring faith in particular doctrines about the divine, not a salvation that depended on being in favor with some external power. What he offered was closer to what a skilled physician offers: careful observation, accurate diagnosis, a credible prognosis, and a practical course of treatment. Something you can verify, he said, for yourself. Come, he said. In the spirit the tradition calls ehipassiko, come and see, don't take my word, investigate. That quality of the teaching, in its invitation to direct examination rather than mere belief, is part of what has made it strange and beautiful and lasting. Let us explore a story about this. There was once a student who had traveled a great distance to study with a teacher. The student arrived full of questions. His mind was crowded with things he had heard, things he had read, things he suspected and half believed and half doubted. He sat down with the teacher and immediately began to talk. He talked about what he had learned before. He talked about what he expected to learn now. He talked about the various schools of thought and which he found convincing and which he found lacking. The teacher listened. Then the teacher poured tea, the cup filled, the tea reached the brim, and the teacher went on pouring. The student watched in astonishment as tea ran over the edge of the cup and onto the table. "Why do you keep pouring?" he asked. "The cup is full. It cannot hold any more." The teacher set down the pot and said quietly, "You are like this cup. Before I can offer you anything, there must be space to receive it." The teaching does not ask for the submission of a mind forced to believe. It asks for the openness of a mind willing to look. That is a different thing entirely, and it is perhaps harder, because a mind willing to genuinely look at its own craving, its own aversion, its own defended sense of a permanent self, will find things that a mind expecting confirmation will not. The Eightfold Path is, at its core, a training in exactly this kind of seeing. To look at your views, right view, is to be willing to hold them loosely enough that what is actually true can come into focus. To examine your intentions, right intention, is to bring honesty to the question of what is actually driving you under the story you are telling yourself about your own motives. This is not comfortable work, but it is real work and it produces real results, and the results are real. This is the message of the third noble truth, stated quietly, but without qualification. The cessation of suffering is possible. Nirodha is not a consolation. It is not a beautiful hypothesis to comfort people in the dark. It is, the teaching says, a fact about the nature of conditioned experience, that the conditions that produce it can, with patient and sincere effort, be changed. The physician does not only diagnose, the physician says, this can be treated, and here is how. That third truth, cessation is possible, is perhaps the most important thing in the whole teaching, and it is, as we noted earlier, the one most often dropped in casual summaries that settle for Buddhism teaches that life is suffering. It does not. It teaches that the kind of suffering that arises from craving and ignorance can end, that the fire can be blown out, that the wheel that has been slightly off its axle, grinding and grinding, can be adjusted, not through miracle or divine intervention, but through the careful, patient, sincere cultivation of wisdom and care and a settled mind. This is an enormous claim, and it is offered with enormous calm. The teaching does not shout this. It does not demand that you believe it before you have investigated it. It simply says, here is the diagnosis. Here is what produces the condition. Here is the evidence that the condition is treatable. And here is the path of treatment. Come and see. Let us now explore another story. Let it carry the teaching somewhere warm. There was once a woman who kept a small garden behind her house. She had kept it for many years, and she was proud of it and also, quietly, anxious about it. She would wake in the night, sometimes worrying about the frost, worrying about whether the soil was right, worrying that some season she would do something wrong and the garden would fail and not come back. One spring, a neighbor, an old woman who had grown things all her long life, came and looked at the garden with her. "You are fighting it," the old woman said. The gardener looked at her. "You are fighting the winter when summer is here," the old woman said. "You are fighting the dry season when the rains are falling. You plant something good and then you stand over it, anxious, as though your anxiety were part of the growing. It is not. The seed knows what to do. Your work is to provide the conditions. Good soil, water at the right time, enough light, and then to step back and trust the process." The gardener thought about this for a long time. The next spring she tried something different. She prepared the soil carefully, she planted with attention, she watered when the ground was dry. And then she sat in the evenings, simply watching the things grow, not anxiously monitoring, not gripping, just attending, and she found something she had not expected. The garden, without her anxiety, was more itself. The plants grew according to their nature. The seasons came and went as seasons do, and she was, for the first time in years, genuinely in the garden, rather than standing just outside it, worrying. This is something the teaching points toward again and again in different words and different images. The Eightfold Path is not a path of desperate striving. It is a path of cultivating the right conditions and then, with genuine effort but without clenching, allowing the natural result to unfold. Right effort is the middle tension, engaged, awake, neither forcing nor abandoning. Right mindfulness is attending without gripping. Right concentration is the settling of the mind that happens when the conditions for settling are present. You cannot force the mind to settle any more than you can force a seed to sprout, but you can remove what hinders it. You can provide what it needs. You can stop standing over it, fists clenched, demanding that it hurry. The teaching is patient because it knows what it takes, and what it takes in the end is simply this: seeing clearly, acting with care, and cultivating the quiet of a mind that is no longer at war with itself. Anicca, dukkha, anatta, impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, non-self. These three marks, when truly received, not just understood intellectually but received, the way warmth is received, the way quiet is received, do something in the person who receives them. They make the grip a little looser, they make the defense a little less urgent, they make it possible to rest in what is actually here, rather than perpetually reaching for what is not yet here, or holding against what is already passing. And when the grip loosens, even a little, even for a moment, what remains is something that was always already present. The still water under the agitated surface. The room that was always there when the light of the fire was not overwhelming it. This is the quiet at the heart of the teaching. Not the quiet of giving up, of lying down in defeat. The quiet of a mind that has stopped fighting a war it invented. That is a very different thing. The teaching names several kinds of liberation that arise as the path deepens. The gradual falling away of the fetters, the internal bonds that keep the wheel of samsara turning. Views about a permanent self fall away first, as anatta is genuinely received rather than just intellectually agreed with, then doubt, then the idea that rules and rituals alone without understanding can produce liberation. These are the first three fetters, and their loosening marks a significant threshold in the path. Further along, sensual desire and ill will soften. Further still, subtler forms of craving for fine material experience, for formless experience, for existence itself, dissolve. And conceit, restlessness, and the final trace of ignorance are the last to go. This progression is described with great care in the texts. It is a map of a journey. And like any map, its value is not in memorizing its details, but in understanding that there is a territory, and the territory is real, and others have traveled it before you and returned to say it is possible. You are not the first person to lie awake at night, the mind busy with its arguments and its rehearsals and its quiet grief. This experience is not new. It is not yours alone. It is one of the oldest and most common of all human experiences, the defended, restless, grasping life that does not quite settle, that does not quite trust that things can be well without the clenching. And into exactly that experience the teaching speaks, not to demand change, not to shame the grasping, but to offer a map, a careful, precise, time-tested map, and to say, there is another way through. When this is, that is. When this ceases, that ceases. The conditions that have produced your difficulty are not permanent. They are not you. They are the river, not the stone. And the river can slowly, gently, with patience and care, learn to flow differently. Take a slow, deep breath. Feel the weight of the body, the contact with whatever is beneath you. The breath moving in and the breath moving out, not because you are making it happen, but because the conditions for breathing are present, and so breathing arises. This, too, is dependent origination, running quietly in the background of every moment. The breath arising from its conditions, the mind arising from its conditions, and you tonight, in this particular moment, resting in the middle of all of it. The impermanent, the processual, the interdependent, and perhaps just a little less afraid of what it is. That is the teaching, not a belief to hold, a direction to turn toward. And tonight, simply turning toward it. Simply listening without the need to understand it all, without the need to remember it all, without the need to do anything at all with it. That is already a kind of practice. The lute string is not forced. It is simply set to its right tension and then left to resonate. Let it resonate in you now, the fire that has been burning, the small, anxious fire of the defended self, the craving and the aversion, the quiet grief of things that did not stay, does not need more fuel tonight. Let it settle. Let it breathe. And when you are ready, we will continue together into what came after, how the teaching moved from one man beneath a fig tree into the long rivers of history and geography and human longing that carried it to the far ends of the world. He died quietly. That is perhaps the first thing to say. There was no dramatic moment, no sudden vanishing, no parting of the sky. The man who had sat beneath the Bodhi tree at Bodh Gaya and understood the nature of the conditioned world died as all conditioned things die. He was approximately 80 years old. The body that had once nearly starved on the banks of a forest river and then recovered its strength on a bowl of milk rice had simply, over the long decades, grown old. And then it stopped. The place was Kushinagar, a small town, not a great capital or a famous pilgrimage site, at least not yet. He had walked there with his attendant Ananda, the beloved companion who had been with him for so many years, who had heard more discourses than anyone alive, and who, the tradition holds, wept when he understood what was coming. He lay down between two sala trees on his right side, in what is called the lion's posture. And he gave quietly his last instructions. Tradition has it that his final meal was something called Sukara Madhava. Scholars have debated this for centuries. The word might mean pig's delight, which some take to mean pork, a rich and tender cut given by a generous host named Kunda the Smith. Others translate it as a kind of mushroom or truffle that pigs are fond of digging up. We genuinely do not know. What we do know is that he became ill after eating it, and we know that he was careful in his last hours to make clear that Kunda was not to blame, that the meal was a gift freely given, and that the host should carry no guilt for what followed. This was the Buddha at the very end, precise, practical, attending to the feelings of the person who might be left behind, feeling responsible for his death. He was, even dying, a physician of the mind. His last words have been preserved in the Pali texts, and they are worth holding tonight. He said, in the language of the Pali canon, something rendered in English as, "All conditioned things are impermanent. Strive on with diligence. Vayadama sankhara apamadena sampadetha." Say it slowly. Vayadama sankhara. All conditioned things are subject to decay. This is anicca, the first of the three marks spoken plainly and without ornamentation in the final breath of the teaching. Everything that arises passes. Everything that is assembled eventually comes apart. He said it with his last words, not because he had forgotten to say it earlier, he had been saying it for 45 years, but because it was, for him, the most important thing, the one thing worth repeating at the very end. Not a comfort, exactly. Something steadier than comfort. A true orientation. Apamadena sampadetha. Strive on with diligence. Do not be careless. Do not drift through the days as if the days were unlimited. Not an urgency of anxiety, but an urgency of care. The teaching is available to you. The path is walkable. Walk it. That is the last instruction. And then something equally significant. He named no human successor. This was not an accident or an oversight. He was asked in his final days who would lead the community after him, and he said clearly, the Dhamma is your teacher now, the teaching itself, the Dhamma, the body of understanding, and the Vinaya, the code of monastic conduct and discipline, these would be the continuing authority. Not a person, not a hierarchy of chosen successors. The teaching, this was consequential. It meant that the community, the Sangha, was held together by its commitment to the Dhamma and to the practice, not by personal loyalty to any one individual. It also meant over the centuries that interpretation and emphasis could vary, that teachers could arise in different places with different understandings, and that the river of Buddhism could and would branch. The absence of a designated successor is one of the quiet architectural facts at the root of why there is not one Buddhism today, but many streams flowing from the same source. He attained what the tradition calls parinirvana, the final nirvana, the complete passing beyond, the extinction not just of the fires of greed and hatred and delusion, but of the conditions that would give rise to any further rebirth. The body came apart. The process that had been Siddhartha Gautama of the Shakya clan, Shakya Muni the sage, the Buddha, the awakened one, that process, that intricate arising of conditions, came to its end. The flame went out. Take a slow, deep breath. The sala trees were in bloom. The tradition says, out of season. Let that be what it is. A beautiful detail offered by those who loved him and tried to find words for something they could barely hold. Ananda wept. He had heard every discourse. He had stood by the teacher for years beyond counting, and he was not yet fully awakened. He would achieve that in the months that followed, after the grief had passed and the practice had deepened further. But that night he wept. And this too is preserved in the texts, not because weeping was the correct response, but because the texts were honest. The teaching was one thing, the human life around the teaching was another. Both mattered. Now the teaching had to survive without him. For perhaps 4 centuries, give yourself a moment to hold that span of time, the words of the Buddha were carried entirely in human memory. No books, no printed pages, no scrolls passed hand to hand in writing. Just the human mind, trained to hold the teachings with extraordinary care, reciting them again and again, checking one recitation against another, preserving the sound and the sequence of the original. The monks and nuns who carried the teachings understood that memory is not passive, it is practiced, it is cultivated. They developed elaborate methods for memorizing and checking the discourses. Groups of monastics would chant the texts together, and discrepancies would be caught and corrected. It was, in its way, a kind of collective organism of preservation, the Sangha itself acting as a living library. Not long after the Buddha's death, the tradition says a few months, and the event is associated with the rainy season retreat that followed, the first Buddhist council was convened at Vajrayana, which had been the capital of the Magadha kingdom. Monks gathered. The assembly was large by the standards of the time, and its purpose was precise, to recite and agree the teachings, to establish what the Buddha had actually said, so that nothing would be lost or distorted in the passing of time. 2 people are at the center of this story. The first is Ananda. Ananda, who had stood beside the Buddha for so long, who had attended every discourse, who had a memory the texts describe as extraordinary, as if the words simply stayed in him wherever they landed, was asked to recite the discourses. The suttas, the conversations and teachings of the Buddha as they had been recorded in the collective memory of the community. Ananda recited them, and each recitation began with a phrase that became the canonical opening of every sutta in the Pali collection, Evam me suttam, thus have I heard. 3 words, 4 syllables. A statement not of authorship, but of transmission, not, I say this is true, but this is what I received, this is what was given to me, and I am giving it to you now, as faithfully as I can. There is something in that phrasing that stays with you, an honesty about the nature of inheritance. The teaching did not come from nowhere, and it is not owned by anyone. It passed through human minds and human voices, and what you are receiving now is the most careful version of the passing on that those people could manage. The second figure at Vajrayana was Upali. Where Ananda recited the discourses, the doctrinal and narrative heart of the teaching, Upali was asked to recite the Vinaya. The Vinaya is the code of monastic discipline, the rules governing how monks and nuns were to live, how disputes were to be settled, how the community was to organize itself. Upali knew these in their entirety. He recited them. The assembly confirmed them, and together the suttas and the Vinaya formed the core of what would eventually become the written canon. But writing was still centuries away. The texts continued in oral form, chanted, memorized, transmitted from teacher to student, from monastery to monastery, through kingdoms and across trade routes, and through the slow centuries. And then, around the 1st century before the Common Era, on the island of Sri Lanka, the decision was made to commit the teachings to writing. The language was Pali, an ancient language related to Sanskrit, and believed by the Theravada tradition to be close to the language the Buddha himself may have spoken, or at least to the linguistic forms in which the teaching was most purely preserved. The result was the Tipitaka. The word means 3 baskets, a basket being how scrolls and manuscripts were physically organized and stored. The 3 baskets were the Vinaya Pitaka, the basket of discipline, the Sutta Pitaka, the basket of discourses, and the Abhidhamma Pitaka, the basket of higher or analytical teachings, a systematic, highly detailed mapping of mind and matter according to the principles the Buddha had laid out. The Pali Canon, the Tipitaka, is the oldest complete surviving Buddhist canon. It is enormous. Printed in Roman transliteration, it runs to tens of thousands of pages. It is, in one sense, the most faithful written record of what was taught in that first community in those first centuries by the people who were closest to the source. Take a slow, deep breath. Let the weight of that time settle around you. Centuries of minds carrying the words in the dark. Monks chanting in the monsoon rains, conversations in forest clearings, at the edges of village markets, in courts and in caves. And then the slow scratch of writing in Sri Lanka, putting the sound into marks on a surface, so that what had lived in breath and voice could now also live in ink. And then, the Emperor. If the Buddha's awakening is the spring from which the river rose, the single figure who more than any other determined where that river would flow was not a monk or a philosopher or a saint. He was a king. His name was Ashoka, and he ruled the Maurya Empire from roughly 268 to 232 BCE, which means he came about 2 centuries after the Buddha's death, when the teaching had been spreading within the Indian subcontinent, but had not yet reached its widest range. Ashoka had come to power through the usual mechanisms of ancient kingship, military conquest, the elimination of rivals, the steady, violent expansion of territory. And in roughly the 8th year of his reign, he waged a war that, by the account preserved in his own edicts, changed him permanently. The war was against the kingdom of Kalinga, in what is now the coastal state of Odisha in eastern India. The Kalinga War was, by the measures of ancient warfare, catastrophic. The edicts say, and these are the actual words of Ashoka, chiseled into rock, the oldest surviving first-hand royal account in Indian history, that 100,000 people were killed and many more died afterward from disease and displacement, and still more were taken captive. The king looked at what he had done, and something in him broke open. He became a follower of the Dhamma, not the first, not the only, not unique in being moved by the teaching, but uniquely placed to do something about it. He had an empire, he had resources, he had the ability to inscribe rock and to send people to distant places, and he used all of it. The Ashokan edicts, pillars of polished sandstone and great flat rock faces carved with inscriptions, are distributed across the subcontinent from what is now Pakistan to southern India, from the plains of the Ganges to the edges of the Deccan. They speak of non-violence, of tolerance, of care for animals and for the poor, of the importance of righteous conduct, which he called Dhamma, using the Buddhist term. They are not purely Buddhist propaganda, and Ashoka seems to have been genuinely pluralistic, supporting other religious traditions as well. But they are saturated with Buddhist sensibility, and they functioned as a kind of broadcast, in stone, of a set of values rooted in the teaching. He also did something more direct. He sent missionaries. The tradition holds, and while this is partly hagiography, the broad outline is accepted by historians, that Ashoka dispatched emissaries carrying the teaching to various regions of the known world, to the Greek kingdoms in the west, to the Tamil kingdoms of the south, to the island of Sri Lanka in the south. It is to Sri Lanka that the most famous of these missions went. His son, Mahinda, led it. Mahinda is described as a monk, an ordained monastic who carried both the teaching and the practice of the monastic community to Sri Lanka's king Devanampiya Tissa. The Sinhalese traditions say that Mahinda converted the king, and that from that point the island became one of the great centers of Buddhist learning and preservation, which is precisely where, a century and a half later, the Pali canon would be written down. And Mahinda was not alone. His sister Sanghamitra followed. She was herself an ordained nun, and she carried something remarkable, a sapling, a cutting from the original Bodhi tree, the ficus religiosa beneath which the prince from the Shakya clan had sat at Bodh Gaya and understood the nature of the conditioned world. That sapling was planted in Anuradhapura in Sri Lanka, and the tree that grew from it is still alive. It is called the Sri Maha Bodhi, and it is one of the oldest historically documented trees on earth. Thousands of years old, rooted in a courtyard in Sri Lanka, grown from a branch of the tree beneath which the first understanding arose. Consider that for a moment. A cut branch from a particular fig tree, carried by a young woman across the sea, planted and tended and grown for more than 2,000 years. Still alive, still putting out leaves in the morning light, in the afternoon heat, in the monsoon rains, in the dark. Take a slow, deep breath and breathe out. From Sri Lanka, the teaching continued, but it also spread in other directions along the great arteries of the ancient world. The network of trade routes that we call the Silk Road, though the name was not used at the time, and silk was only one of the many goods moving along those paths, connected the Indian subcontinent to Central Asia, to Persia, to China, and eventually beyond. Buddhism traveled those roads alongside merchants and diplomats and wandering monks, carried in the minds and the mouths and the manuscript bags of those who had received the teaching and wished to share it. By roughly the 1st century of the Common Era, Buddhism had reached China. The exact manner of its arrival is uncertain. The traditions offer various accounts, none of them historically verified with precision. But it was real, and it took hold. From China, over the following centuries, it spread to Korea, and from Korea to Japan. The Northern Path carried the teaching into Tibet, beginning most substantially in the 7th and 8th centuries of the Common Era, when Tibetan kings invited Buddhist masters and began the long, careful work of translation and integration that would produce one of the most elaborate and textured Buddhist cultures in human history. The southern and southeastern paths carried it to Burma, to Thailand, to Cambodia, to Laos, countries where it became, and in many cases remains, central to the texture of daily life, the rhythm of the agricultural year, the ceremonies of birth and death and passage. Before any of this, something interesting happened to the image of the Buddha himself. For the first few centuries after his death, the Buddha was almost never depicted as a human figure in religious art. This early period is called the aniconic phase, meaning without images or against images. The Buddha's presence was indicated by symbols, his footprints carved in stone, heavy and detailed, with the Dharmachakra wheel marked on their soles. The 8-spoked wheel itself, symbol of the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta and the Eightfold Path. The empty seat beneath the Bodhi tree, a cushion or a throne shown without a figure on it, the absence itself indicating the one who had sat there. The Bodhi tree in full leaf. The symbols were precise and meaningful, but the human form was not used. And then the tradition changed. The anthropomorphic Buddha image, the figure in meditation, or in the earth-touching gesture, or walking, or reclining, emerged and became the dominant form of representation. And here is a detail that still surprises people when they encounter it. The region where this happened first and most influentially was Gandhara, in what is now northwestern Pakistan, and parts of Afghanistan. The Gandhara region had a few centuries earlier been under the influence of the Greek kingdoms that followed in the wake of Alexander the Great's campaigns. The art of those kingdoms was deeply Hellenistic, classical Greek in style, with the drapery, the proportions, the facial features of Mediterranean sculpture. When Buddhist artists in Gandhara began to depict the Buddha in human form, they drew on this Hellenistic visual vocabulary. The early Gandharan Buddhas have curly hair that looks like Greek marble sculpture. The robes fall in Mediterranean folds. The facial features are finely structured in the Greco-Roman manner. The halo behind the head is a form found in Hellenistic and later Roman religious art. What we now think of as the Buddha, the serene, idealized human figure that appears in temples and meditation rooms across the world, is partly the product of a fusion between the Shakya wisdom teaching from the Gangetic plain and the artistic vocabulary of the Greek kingdoms of Bactria. The world has always been more connected than we imagine. The wisdom that a man from the Shakya clan arrived at beneath a fig tree in northern India was eventually rendered in an artistic form shaped by the descendants of Alexander's soldiers. And that image then traveled the Silk Road into China and Japan and Korea and Tibet and Southeast Asia, and eventually into every corner of the world where Buddhism has found a home. It is a long and winding river, and its waters come from many springs. Take a slow, deep breath. And now, gently, let us look at the three great branches the river became. When the teaching spread, carried by monks and merchants and missionaries, shaped by different cultures and languages and philosophical temperaments, it did not remain a single uniform thing. The Buddha had said that the Dhamma and the Vinaya would be the teacher after him, but different communities in different places over different centuries understood and emphasized different aspects of what the Dhamma contained. Three major streams eventually crystallized, each representing a distinct way of holding the original spring. The first is Theravada. The name means the doctrine of the elders. Thera, meaning elder, Vada, meaning teaching or doctrine. This is the form of Buddhism that took deep root in Sri Lanka and spread through much of Southeast Asia, where it remains today the dominant form of practice in Myanmar, Thailand, Cambodia, and Laos. Theravada is conservative in the sense of being deliberately close to the Pali canon, the texts agreed upon at that first council at Rajagaha, written down in Sri Lanka, that oldest complete surviving scriptural record. The ideal figure in the Theravada understanding is the arhat, a word sometimes rendered as worthy one or accomplished one. The arhat is someone who has walked the Eightfold Path to its end, who has extinguished the fires of greed, hatred, and delusion, who will not be reborn, who has attained nirvana. The path is understood as available to those who dedicate themselves to it fully. Traditionally, the monastic life is the clearest vehicle, though the lay community is deeply valued and lay practice is robust. The Theravada emphasis is on the individual's own liberation, achieved through the practices the Buddha himself taught: ethical conduct, meditation, wisdom. The Dhamma is a raft, as the Buddha described it, a raft you use to cross the river. Theravada keeps close to the raft. The second great branch is Mahayana. The name means the great vehicle, Maha for great, Yana for vehicle. It began arising around the 1st century before the Common Era or thereabouts, possibly earlier, possibly somewhat later. Scholars debate the precise origins, and it represents a significant expansion and reconceptualization of certain aspects of the teaching. The central innovation of Mahayana is the bodhisattva ideal. A bodhisattva, the word means roughly a being whose essence is awakening, is someone who aspires not merely to their own liberation, but to the liberation of all sentient beings. The bodhisattva in the Mahayana framing stands at the threshold of nirvana and chooses to return again and again, moved by compassion until every being has crossed the river. This is the expansion that gives Mahayana its name. The vehicle is great because it carries everyone, not just those who devote themselves fully to the monastic path. Compassion, karuna, becomes, in Mahayana, not just a quality to cultivate, but the very engine of the path. Mahayana also introduced an expanded body of sutras, texts presented as the word of the Buddha, though they appeared centuries after his death and their origins are debated. The Lotus Sutra, the Heart Sutra, the Diamond Sutra, these are among the most widely read and chanted texts in the Buddhist world. The Heart Sutra, famously brief, contains the teaching of shunyata, emptiness, in concentrated form. Shunyata is the Mahayana deepening of the Theravada teaching of anatta, not just that the self is without a permanent independent core, but that all phenomena, all things whatsoever, are empty of inherent existence. They arise in dependence on conditions and have no fixed, independent, self-contained nature. Form is emptiness. Emptiness is form. The familiar words of the Heart Sutra. Mahayana also develops the concept of Buddha nature, the teaching that every sentient being carries within them the seed or the capacity, or indeed the very essence of awakening. The flame is already present. The practice is a matter of recognizing what is already there rather than acquiring something new. Within Mahayana, a great variety of schools and traditions arose. Zen, or Chan as it is called in Chinese, the form that took root in China and traveled to Japan and Korea and eventually to the West, is one of the most distinctive. Chan Zen emphasizes direct experience of awakening rather than textual study, the transmission of understanding from teacher to student in an intimate, personal way, the use of paradox and sudden interruption to break open habitual conceptual thinking. The famous sitting meditation practice, Zazen, is at its center. The great Zen teachers, the koans, the brush paintings, the tea ceremony as a form of practice, all of this is a flower of the Mahayana tradition. Pure Land Buddhism, another major stream within Mahayana, centers on devotion to Amitabha Buddha, a Buddha of boundless light described in the Mahayana Sutras, and the aspiration to be reborn in his pure land, a realm of ideal conditions for practice. Pure Land traditions became enormously widespread in China and Japan. For vast numbers of ordinary people across the centuries, the recitation of the name of Amitabha, Namu Amida Butsu in Japanese, was and remains the central practice. A way of opening the heart, a way of aligning oneself with compassion. The third great branch is Vajrayana. The name means the diamond vehicle or the thunderbolt vehicle. Vajra, meaning both diamond for its indestructibility and thunderbolt for its power. Vajrayana is sometimes described as a distinct development within or alongside Mahayana, using Mahayana philosophy as its doctrinal ground, but adding a layer of practice drawn from the tantric traditions of India, traditions involving mantra, sacred sound, mandala, sacred geometric diagrams used as objects of contemplation and visualization, deity visualization, in which the practitioner meditates by identifying with an enlightened figure, inhabiting the perspective of awakening as a method of reaching it, and a particularly intimate and essential relationship with a teacher, a guru or lama, who guides the practitioner through this territory. Vajrayana claims to be a swifter path, not because it bypasses the hard work of ethical conduct and meditation, but because its methods engage the whole person, including the passions and the emotions, transforming them rather than suppressing them. The fires of desire and anger in the Vajrayana understanding contain energy that can be redirected. The path does not avoid what is difficult in the human being, it works with it. Vajrayana took root most deeply in Tibet, where it became the organizing principle of an entire civilization. Libraries, art, architecture, governance, medicine, philosophy, all saturated with the Dharma as the Tibetan tradition understood it. It spread to Bhutan, to Mongolia, to the Himalayan regions. The Dalai Lama, the title meaning ocean teacher, given to the head of the Gelug school of Tibetan Buddhism, who is understood as a living manifestation of Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva of compassion, is perhaps the most globally recognized Buddhist figure of the modern era. 3 vehicles, 3 vast rivers, each with its own landscape, its own light, its own particular way of moving, and at their source, a single spring, a single man sitting beneath a fig tree at Bodh Gaya in the early morning as the last star faded. Take a slow, deep breath and breathe out. We have come a long way together tonight. Let us stay here for a moment before we rest and gather what we have walked through. Not to test you, not to see if you remember it. You do not need to remember any of it. If one image stayed with you, one phrase, one small thing that landed and is still there, that is enough. That is already more than enough. We began tonight with a restless self, a mind that comes alive just when the body is trying to be still. A small, defended thing, rehearsing its worries and its identities, craving what it wants and recoiling from what it fears. And we traced that restless self back to its source, to a teaching 2,500 years old, from the banks of a river in northern India, given to 5 wandering monks in a deer park at Sarnath on a warm evening in the 5th century before the Common Era. We met Siddhartha Gautama of the Shakya clan, Shakya Muni, the sage of the Shakyas, born at Lumbini in the foothills of what is now Nepal. His birthplace later marked by the great Ashokan pillar that still stands there. We met his father, Suddhodana, and his mother Maya, and his aunt Mahapajapati Gotami, who raised him. We met the pleasure palaces of Kapilavastu, and the prophecy and the sheltered life, and the 4 sights that broke that sheltering open. The old man, the sick man, the corpse, and the wandering ascetic who had found somehow a kind of peace in the middle of all that impermanence. We met Yasodhara and Rahula and the great renunciation at about 29. We walked through the 6 years of severe asceticism, the 5 companions, the near starvation. We sat with Sujata and the bowl of milk rice, and in that small, quiet act of receiving, of accepting nourishment, of choosing the middle ground between self-punishment and self-indulgence, we found the heart of what the teaching would become. The middle way, Majjhima Patipada. Not the path of denial, not the path of excess, the path of what is actually workable, actually sustainable, actually aligned with how things are. We sat beneath the Bodhi tree at Bodh Gaya, the ficus religiosa, still standing in its descended form, and we understood what the word Buddha means, the awakened one. From the root Buddha, to wake up, to know, not a god, not a supernatural being, a person who woke up, a title, not a name. We heard the wheel set in motion at Sarnath at the deer park in the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta. We sat with the 4 noble truths, not as a grim announcement that life is suffering, but as a physician's careful work, a diagnosis, a cause, a prognosis that is genuinely hopeful, and a prescription. Dukkha, the out-of-jointness, the subtle unsatisfactoriness, the potter's wheel slightly off its axle, even in our happiest moments. Tanha, the craving, the thirst that drives the wheel. Nirodha. The third truth, the one most often forgotten. Cessation is possible. The fire can go out. This is not a permanent condition. There is a way through. And Magga. The path, the Eightfold Path, the 8 spokes cultivated together, not as a ladder but as a wheel, each supporting the others. We walked the 3 trainings: wisdom, ethical conduct, mental discipline, Panna, Sila, Samadhi, right view and right intention, right speech and right action, and right livelihood, right effort and right mindfulness, and right concentration. We understood that sama, the word translated as right, is closer to complete, or whole, or harmonious, not a rule to follow, an alignment to move toward. We rested with the 3 marks, anicca, dukkha, anatta. The impermanence that is not a tragedy, but a simple description of what is. The unsatisfactoriness that arises when we try to freeze what flows. And anatta, the teaching that what you call yourself is not a fixed, permanent, independent soul, but a flowing process, a bundle of changing aggregates arising in dependence on conditions without a hard, unchanging core. Not you don't exist, something subtler, and in its way more freeing. You exist as a river exists, real, moving, made of water that is always passing through. We walked the 12 links of dependent origination. When this is, that is, the long chain of conditions flowing from ignorance through craving through the whole wheel of samsara. And we held the possibility, a genuine possibility, the 3rd truth again, that the chain can be interrupted, that a different way of meeting experience is available, that the river can learn slowly and with care to flow differently. And tonight we followed what happened after the last star faded at Bodh Gaya, and the teaching was given and a community formed, and 45 years passed, and an old man lay down between 2 sala trees at Kushinagar and breathed his last words into the morning air. Vayadhamma Sankara Apamadena Sampadetha. All conditioned things are impermanent. Strive on with diligence. We met Ananda weeping. We sat with the first council at Rajagaha. We heard Ivami Sutam, thus have I heard, the opening words of 10,000 suttas, the sound of one generation passing the flame to the next. We watched the teaching travel from voice to voice for 4 centuries until the monks of Sri Lanka put it into writing, into the Tipitaka, the 3 baskets, the oldest, complete, surviving canon. We met Ashoka, the king undone by his own victory at Kalinga, who looked at what violence had made and chose something else. The edicts in stone across the subcontinent. Mahinda, his son the monk, crossing the sea to Sri Lanka. And Sanghamitta, his daughter the nun, carrying a branch of the Bodhi tree that was planted at Anuradhapura and is still alive today, still putting out leaves in the warm Sri Lankan air. We watched the Silk Road carry the teaching into Central Asia and China and Korea and Japan and north into Tibet. We paused at the quiet surprise of Gandhara, where Hellenistic artists, descendants of the world Alexander's campaigns had made, first gave the Buddha a human face shaped in the style of Greek marble, and sent that image moving along the trade roads into the visual imagination of the entire Buddhist world. And we rested with the 3 rivers. Theravada, the doctrine of the elders, close to the Pali texts, the Arhat ideal, the careful and beautiful tradition that holds the teaching in Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia. Mahayana, the great vehicle, the bodhisattva who returns again and again until all beings have crossed, the shunyata of the Heart Sutra, the Buddha nature already present in everything that breathes, the quiet and the sudden illumination of Zen, the devotional warmth of Pure Land. and Vajrayana, the diamond vehicle, the thunderbolt, the tantric methods and the mandalas and the living lineage of teachers in Tibet and the Himalayan world, the Dalai Lama, the ocean of compassion that wears a human face. 3 branches. 1 river, 1 spring, 1 man sitting very still in the early morning under a large leafed tree, understanding something about the nature of what he was. You do not need to carry any of this forward tonight. You do not need to believe it or agree with it or remember the Pali terms or hold the historical sequence in order. If one image is still with you, the bowl of milk rice at the edge of a forest, the earth-touching hand, the flame going quietly out, the sapling carried across the sea by a woman who believed it mattered, let that be enough. More than enough. The teaching was always, in its deepest register, very simple. There is a kind of out-of-jointness in life as we ordinarily live it. There is a reason for that out-of-jointness, and there is a way through. Not a promise of perfection, not an abolition of difficulty, but an orientation, a direction, a path that is wide enough to walk, balanced enough to sustain, and old enough to have been tested by 10,000 feet across 10,000 seasons. The lute string set to its right tension, not too tight, not too slack. Let yourself be tonight at the right tension, not grasping, not collapsing, somewhere in the middle, which is, it turns out, where the music is. The salad trees were in bloom, out of season, when he lay down. Perhaps that is hagiography. Perhaps it is the love of the people who were there, reaching for a metaphor their grief could hold. But somewhere tonight, in Sri Lanka, a very old tree is putting out leaves in the dark. Descended from the tree beneath which the understanding arose. Still rooted, still breathing, still. And you are somewhere tonight, in whatever time zone and city or town or house or room you are in. You who took a breath and chose to listen, who let the teaching come close without demanding anything of yourself. You are part of the long, branching, river-wide, stone-inscribed, silk road-traveling, Bodhi tree-rooted story of what it means for a human being to wake up. Sleep well. Subject closed for the night. Let it all relax away.